The second Bradford said the word overhead, I knew we were done. He said it slow, deliberate, like he was chewing on it, savoring the taste. Overhead. Like I ran a break room. Like the 18 people in maintenance were just line items on a spreadsheet he was itching to erase. I was standing at the back of the shop floor conference room, arms crossed, wearing the same navy work shirt with my name stitched over the pocket that I'd worn every day for 22 years. Around me, 40-something people from every department stood shoulder to shoulder listening to the new owner introduce himself. Bradford Kane, 41 years old, freshly minted MBA, smell still clinging to his cufflinks. He'd bought Meridian Manufacturing 3 weeks ago through some private equity outfit nobody in Ohio had ever heard of. He stood up on that little riser we used for safety meetings, hands clasped behind his back, and told the room he was going to unlock hidden value. That's the phrase he used, unlock, like the company had been sitting on a treasure chest and nobody had thought to check the drawer. Then he pointed at the org chart projected on the wall behind him and said it. We're going to be looking hard at overhead. Maintenance, quality, engineering support, these are cost centers. In a modern operation, we need to right-size them. Right size, cost center, overhead. The floor went quiet in that specific way a shop floor goes quiet when everybody's thinking the same thing but nobody's dumb enough to say it. I felt eyes flick toward me. Toby from press number 4, Denise from the paint line, Marco who ran second shift. They all knew what maintenance did around here. They knew who kept the presses from eating themselves alive. They knew whose phone rang at 3 in the morning when the compressor tripped and the whole plant lost air. They knew, and Bradford Kane did not. I didn't say anything, just uncrossed my arms, slid my hands into my pockets and looked down at the concrete. 22 years of oil stains on that floor. I could tell you where every one of them came from. That dark patch near the loading bay was hydraulic fluid from the 09 palletizer incident. The rust ring by column B7 was from when the roof leaked in 2016, and I stood there in the rain welding a temporary patch at midnight so we wouldn't lose the Wednesday production run. Bradford didn't know any of that. Bradford didn't know that half the equipment in this building was older than he was. He didn't know that our OEE numbers, the ones he was so impressed by in the sale documents, were the way they were because my crew had rebuilt every critical machine twice over with parts we fabricated ourselves in-house. He didn't know that overhead was the only reason his shiny new asset produced a single unit a day. But he was about to learn. I let the meeting end, clapped politely when everybody else did. Walked out with the same slow stride I'd walked out with 1,000 times before. I stopped by the time clock, badged out for lunch, and went and sat in my truck in the parking lot with the windows up and the engine off. My name is Ray. I was 56 years old when Bradford Kane bought the plant. I ran the maintenance and reliability department at Meridian Manufacturing in a small town outside Toledo. 18 guys, every one of them hand-picked. Every one of them worth 10 of whatever clipboard-carrying consultant Bradford was about to march through the front gate. I sat in that truck for a long time, didn't turn on the radio, didn't eat my sandwich, just watched the sun move across the windshield, and I made a decision. I gave Bradford exactly 3 days before I started building my file, not a resignation letter, not yet, a file. A red 3-ring binder I bought at the office supply store on Monroe Street on my way home that Tuesday night. I put it on the kitchen table and my wife Corinne looked at it and then looked at me and didn't ask a single question. 31 years of marriage teaches you when to talk and when to pour a second cup of coffee and leave the room. She poured, she left. I labeled the binder Meridian Reference Materials. Boring. Bureaucratic. The kind of title that would make anybody's eyes glaze over if they happened to see it sitting on my desk. Inside, though, I started assembling everything. Every custom PLC program I'd written for the 2 big Bliss presses. Every wiring diagram I'd hand-drawn when the original prints went missing in the 2011 flood. Every vendor contact, not the ones in the SAP system, the real ones, the cell phone number of the retired Fanuc tech in Michigan who would drive down on a Saturday if I asked, The guy at the bearing house who'd overnight us a spindle assembly on a handshake because he trusted me. The passwords for the 6 pieces of legacy control equipment nobody had documentation for anymore. The manual override sequences for the hydraulic press safeties. The spreadsheet I maintained on my own time that tracked predicted failure windows on every critical asset based on hours of run time and vibration data I collected with a handheld meter. None of it was proprietary. None of it belonged to Meridian. It was all knowledge I'd built in my own head over 22 years and written down on my own initiative because nobody at the company had ever asked me to. The old owner, Mr. Halloran, had trusted me to run the department. He'd never once demanded documentation. He'd said, "Ray, just keep it running," and I had, and he'd left me alone. Bradford was going to demand documentation. I could feel it coming. So I made sure the documentation existed. It just wasn't going to exist inside the Meridian file server. Wednesday afternoon, Bradford's consultant showed up. Tall kid, maybe 30, wearing a slim-cut suit on a shop floor where OSHA required steel toes. He introduced himself as Preston. Preston from the operational excellence practice at whatever firm Bradford had retained. He had a tablet and a lanyard and a smile that looked like it had been taught to him in a mirror. Preston wanted to walk the floor with me, understand the maintenance function, do a capability assessment. I walked him around for 4 hours, answered every question he asked, showed him the CMMS system, the work order backlog, the spare parts crib. I was polite. I was thorough. I was the model of a cooperative department head, and every time he asked me a question that touched on the real knowledge, the tribal stuff, the workarounds, the reason the number 3 press ran at all, I gave him the surface answer and nothing more. How do you handle the intermittent fault on the Minster line? We monitor it and respond as needed. Is there a documented procedure? Not a formal one, no. Interesting. We'll want to build that out. I nodded. Wrote nothing down. At the end of the walkthrough, Preston tapped his tablet and said, cheerful as a weather forecaster, that his preliminary read was that maintenance was probably over-resourced by around 40%. Said it right to my face. Said Bradford would be issuing recommendations by the end of the following week. I thanked him for his time, shook his hand, watched him walk out through the loading bay where the 09 hydraulic stain still lived in the concrete. Then I went back to my office and added one more page to the binder. Thursday morning, I called a department meeting for the maintenance crew. Not on the calendar, not in the conference room, just in the shop around the workbench in the maintenance bay at 6:15 a.m. before the day's shift hit the floor. 18 guys. Every one of them had gotten a text from me the night before. Just 3 words. Bay, 6:15, coffee. They showed up. Every single one. Denny brought the box of donuts he always brought when he could tell something was up. Manny, my second in command, had his arms crossed before he even walked in the door. He knew. He'd been in that meeting Monday, standing right next to me. Manny didn't miss much. I didn't waste their time. I told them exactly what Preston had said. Over-resourced by 40%. Recommendations by end of next week. I told them what recommendations meant coming out of the mouth of a private equity consultant. It meant 7 of them, minimum, were going to get walked out the front gate with a box of their personal tools and a 2-week severance if they were lucky. Nobody spoke for a minute. Denny set down the donut he was holding. Manny uncrossed his arms and put his hands on the workbench and leaned forward, looking at the floor. Then Roy, who'd been a millwright at this plant for 34 years, longer than I had, said, "So what's the play, Ray?" That was the question I'd been waiting for. I told them I wasn't going to fight it. I wasn't going to file grievances. I wasn't going to write a letter to the board. I wasn't going to organize a walkout or leak anything to the local paper or do any of the things a man in my position might be expected to do. I was going to do my job. I was going to do my job exactly the way the org chart said I should do it. Not a step more, not a step less. If there wasn't a work order in the system, I wasn't going to touch it. If a machine started making a noise nobody had officially reported, I wasn't going to walk over there and put my ear on the housing and figure out what was coming. If Marco on second shift called my cell phone at 11 at night the way he had 1,000 times before, I was going to let it ring and in the morning I was going to tell him politely to please put in a ticket through the proper channels. And I told them I expected every one of them to do the exact same thing. No sabotage. Nothing they could point to. Nothing anybody could ever write up. Just the job. Just the description on the piece of paper in HR. Just what a right-sized maintenance department staffed by cost center employees would do in a modern operation. Manny finally looked up. He had a small smile at the corner of his mouth. "Malicious compliance," he said. "No malice," I said. "Just compliance." Roy laughed once dry. Denny picked his donut back up. "I told them one more thing. I told them that if any of them wanted no part of this, if any of them thought this was a bad idea, if any of them needed to keep their head down and stay employed, and do the extra reach that we'd all been doing forever, I understood. I would not hold it against a single man in that room. Some of them had kids in college. Some of them had wives on chemo. Some of them had mortgages that didn't care about principal. Not one of them stepped back." Roy said, "Ray, I've been picking up slack in this building since before you had gray hair. If Bradford wants to find out what the slack was, let him find out." That was Thursday, 6:28 a.m. The presses were still running. For now. The rest of that Thursday was the quietest day the maintenance department had ever had. Not quiet in the sense that nothing happened. Quiet in the sense that we did exactly what the ticketing system told us to do and nothing else. 3 preventive maintenance work orders came through in the morning queue. We knocked them out. A lube route on the packaging line was scheduled for the afternoon. Denny ran it. A bearing swap on the number 2 conveyor motor came in from production around 11. Manny handled it in 40 minutes. That was it. That was the entire officially documented workload for a department of 18 men on a Thursday at a stamping and assembly plant that ran 3 shifts. Anybody who's ever worked in a real factory knows what a lie that number is. On a normal Thursday, that same department would have handled probably 60 distinct issues. Little stuff. A guard interlock acting flaky on press 4, a guy would walk over, wiggle the connector, fix it in 90 seconds, no ticket. A hydraulic leak weeping under the palletizer, somebody would grab a rag and a new fitting from the crib and swap it during a shift change, no ticket. An operator saying, "Hey Ray, the number 6 spindle sounds funny," and me walking over with a stethoscope and catching a failing bearing 3 weeks before it seized, no ticket. None of that happened Thursday. The guard interlock on press 4 went unreported. I saw the operator jiggling the connector himself around 10 a.m. I walked past, nodded, kept walking. He looked at me a little confused because normally I would have stopped. I didn't stop. The hydraulic weep under the palletizer got worse through the day. By second shift there was a small puddle. Marco called me at 6 p.m. I let it go to voicemail. In the morning I listened to it, wrote back a polite email CCing Preston and said, "Please have the operator submit a work order through the CMMS, and it will be prioritized according to the standard queue." The number 6 spindle nobody said anything about because nobody was walking around listening for it. That's not on the org chart. That's not in the job description. That was Ray being Ray, and Ray was no longer being Ray. Ray was being a department head who followed the ticketing procedure exactly as written in the employee handbook. Preston came by my office around 2 in the afternoon. He was in a good mood. He'd spent his morning in the front office with Bradford going over opportunity areas. He wanted to schedule a follow-up walkthrough for the following Tuesday. He also wanted, he said with that same taut smile, to see if I could put together a documentation package for the department, standard operating procedures for common maintenance interventions, so that the knowledge could be institutionalized. I told him I thought that was a great idea. I told him I would be happy to put something together. I told him that given my normal workload, and given that documentation of that scope was not currently in my job description or performance objectives, I would need it added as a formal deliverable with a timeline, and I would need to know which of my other responsibilities he wanted deprioritized to make room for it. He blinked. He hadn't expected that answer. He'd expected me to say, "Sure thing," and pull an all-nighter and hand him a beautiful binder on Monday morning for free. I smiled. I said, "Just let me know how you'd like to proceed, Preston. I'm here to support the process." He said he'd get back to me. He walked out. I sat at my desk. On the wall behind me was a calendar from a bearing supplier with a picture of a lighthouse on it. I looked at that lighthouse for a long time. Thursday ended. Nothing had broken yet. Friday morning, the first press went down. It was press number 3. Of course it was press number 3. That machine had been on borrowed time for 8 months, and the only reason it was still running was that I'd been personally babying it. Ultrasonic checks every Tuesday. A specific torque procedure on the flywheel bolts I did myself on the first Saturday of every month on my own time because it wasn't on any schedule. I hadn't done the torque check the previous Saturday. That Saturday had been the day after the overhead meeting, and I'd sat in my truck instead of driving in. At 7:40 on Friday morning, first shift, press 3 threw a flywheel key. The whole machine bucked once, hard enough that the operator later said his coffee cup jumped off the console and shattered on the floor. Then it seized. Every safety interlock in the building tripped. The main air compressor cycled down. The stamping line, which fed the assembly line, which fed the packaging line, which fed the shipping dock, went dark all the way down the row. 340 people on first shift stood there looking at their machines. The floor supervisor, a guy named Kirk, came running into the maintenance bay at 7:43, face red, radio in his hand. He needed me on press 3 right now, this second. I was standing at the workbench with a cup of coffee. I said, "Has a work order been submitted?" Kirk stared at me like I'd started speaking Portuguese. I said, "Kirk, per the new operating procedures Mr. Kane's team has been rolling out, I need a ticket in the CMMS before I can dispatch a technician. If you can put it in the system as a priority one, we'll respond within the priority 1 SLA, which is 4 hours. 4 hours. Kirk said, Ray, come on." I said, "I'm sorry, Kirk. This is the process." He turned around and ran back toward the office. I sipped my coffee. Manny, standing next to me, didn't smile, didn't move, didn't say a word. Roy was over at the parts crib pretending to reorganize a drawer of snap rings. Denny was reading a maintenance journal. At 7:51, my phone rang. It was Bradford's office. His assistant, a woman named Lindsay who I'd met exactly once. She said Mr. Kane needed me in the executive conference room immediately. I said I'll be right up as soon as I finish briefing my team on the priority 1 work order that just came in. I took my time. I walked. I did not run. 22 years of walking that shop floor and I had never once run, not even the night the compressor caught fire. Ray does not run. I got to the executive conference room at 8:04. Bradford was standing at the head of the table. Preston was next to him, tablet in hand, no smile anymore. The plant manager, a decent guy named Hollies who'd been kept on after the sale, was sitting off to one side looking like he wanted to be anywhere else on earth. There was one empty chair. I did not sit down. I stood at parade rest, hands behind my back, the way I'd stood in the Navy 38 years ago. Bradford said, "Ray, press 3 is down. The line is down. Kirk tells me you refuse to dispatch." I said, "I didn't refuse anything, Mr. Kane." I asked him to follow the ticketing procedure. Once the ticket is in the system, we'll respond within the priority 1 service level, which is currently 4 hours per the CMMS configuration. Bradford said, 4 hours. The line is bleeding money every minute it's down. I said, "I understand, sir. Would you like to authorize an expedited response outside of the standard SLA?" Preston looked at Bradford. Bradford looked at Preston. Neither of them knew what to say. Bradford recovered fast, I'll give him that. He was a lot of things I didn't like, but he wasn't slow on his feet. He said, "Ray, authorize it, expedited response, whatever you need." I said, "Yes, sir. I'll need a written authorization to bypass the SLA. Email is fine, just so we have it in the record." Preston started typing on his tablet. I said, "One more thing, Mr. Kane. When my team gets on the machine, we're going to need to determine root cause. Based on the symptoms Kirk described, the buck, the seize, the interlock cascade, my initial guess is a flywheel key failure. That would be consistent with the fatigue pattern I've been watching on that asset for the last 8 months. Bradford said, "You've been watching it for 8 months." I said, "Yes, sir. Informally, off the books, on my own time. It wasn't part of the documented PM schedule. He said, "Why the hell not?" I said, "Because the documented PM schedule was written to the manufacturer's spec 15 years ago and doesn't account for the specific wear pattern this asset has developed based on the tooling we run on it. The informal monitoring was something I did on my own initiative because I understood the machine. That kind of informal work is exactly the kind of thing Mr. Preston identified as non-value-added activity during his capability assessment on Wednesday." The room went quiet. Preston stopped typing. I did not look at Preston. I kept my eyes on Bradford. I kept my voice completely flat. No sarcasm. No edge. Just a middle-aged maintenance manager standing in front of the new owner giving him a factual report on the status of his equipment. Bradford said, "Preston said the informal work was non-value added." I said, "Mr. Preston's preliminary read was that the department was over-resourced by approximately 40%. I took that to mean that the informal and undocumented activities the department historically performed were not viewed as necessary to the operation, so we adjusted our approach to align with the new expectations." Bradford turned his head very slowly and looked at Preston. Preston's face did something interesting. It went pink first, then a little white around the mouth. He started to say, That's not exactly what I—" Bradford held up a hand. He said, "How long to fix the press, Ray?" I said, "If it's the flywheel key, which I believe it is, we're looking at a minimum of 36 hours if we can source a replacement key stock locally. If we can't, and we have to have one machined, we're looking at 4 to 6 days. In the meantime, the assembly and packaging lines downstream will remain idle unless we can reroute production to press 1, which is possible but will require a die change that runs about 6 hours. Bradford said 6 days. I said, "Potentially, yes, sir. I need to make some calls to confirm parts availability." He said, "Make the calls." I said, "Yes, sir. I'll need a purchase authorization since the projected cost will exceed my department's discretionary spend limit." He said, "Whatever you need, just make it happen." I nodded once. I turned and walked out of the executive conference room. I walked back down the stairs through the front office past the reception desk where the old girl Marlene had worked for 19 years and always kept a candy dish on her counter, and out onto the shop floor. Manny was waiting for me in the maintenance bay. He said, "Well," I said, "get Roy, we're on press 3. Bradford authorized expedited response." Manny said, "You want me to call the guy in Michigan?" I said, "Not yet. Let's take a look first. I want Bradford to hear about the Michigan guy from me at exactly the right moment." Manny nodded slowly. He said, "Ray, this is going to get ugly." I said, "It already is." We opened up press 3 at 9:30 Friday morning. It took us about 20 minutes to confirm what I already knew. Flywheel key, sheared clean. Secondary damage to the keyway itself, which meant we weren't just replacing a piece of stock steel. We were going to have to pull the flywheel, inspect the shaft, and potentially have the keyway recut on a portable mill. Roy went in first with the borescope, came out shaking his head. Manny looked at me. I looked at the ceiling. I walked over to my office and called Haverson. Haverson was the retired Fanuc tech in Michigan I'd mentioned to the crew. He was 72 years old, lived on a lake outside Kalamazoo, and had forgotten more about mechanical press repair than most people would ever learn. He'd worked for the OEM back when the OEM still existed as an independent company, before it got bought and rebranded and hollowed out. He knew the Bliss and Minster lines better than the guys currently building them. And he owed me nothing, but he liked me, and he liked a challenge, and he had a pickup truck. He picked up on the third ring. I told him what happened. He was quiet for about 10 seconds, which for Haverson was the equivalent of a long lecture. Then he said, "The 78 or the 82? I said, "The 82. He said, "Keyway's soft on those. I told them in 84 they should upgrade the alloy. They didn't listen, never do." I said, "Can you come down?" He said, "I can be there tomorrow morning. I'll bring the portable mill and a set of key stock. What's your rate?" I said, "It's not my rate, Haverson. It's the new owner's rate, and he's going to pay whatever you ask." Haverson laughed for the first time in the 4 years I'd known him. It was a short, dry laugh like sandpaper on a 2x4. He said, "Ray, are you finally getting some respect over there?" I said, "I'm getting something. Not sure it's respect yet. Send me your number and I'll have purchasing cut you a PO by end of day. He said, see you at 7 a.m. I hung up. Walked back out to the bay, told Manny that Haverson was coming and to have the flywheel ready to pull by the time he arrived. Manny nodded and started rounding up chain hoists. At 11:15, Preston came down to the shop floor. He was not smiling. His tablet was tucked under his arm like he'd forgotten it was there. He walked up to me at the workbench and asked if he could have a word. I said, sure, Preston. What can I do for you? He said, Ray, about Wednesday. When I said the department was over-resourced, I want to be clear that was a preliminary observation based on documented workflows. I wasn't suggesting that the informal work you described this morning was. I let him hang there for a second, watched him try to find the end of his own sentence. I said, Preston, it's fine. You gave your assessment based on what was documented. That's your job. I gave my response based on what's documented too. That's mine. If Mr. Kane wants to revise the scope of what my department is expected to do, I'm happy to have that conversation. But I'd like it in writing and I'd like it to include a revised staffing plan and budget. Because if the informal work is expected, it needs to be resourced. And right now, per your assessment, it isn't. Preston nodded very slowly. He said, I understand. I said, good. Now if you'll excuse me, I need to go get a flywheel out of a press. I walked away. I didn't look back. Behind me, 340 people were still standing next to dark machines. By 3 o'clock Friday afternoon, the news had traveled the whole plant. Not because I told anybody. I didn't have to. In a factory, information moves faster than air. First shift told second shift when they overlapped at the time clock. Second shift told third. By Saturday morning, when Haverson rolled into the parking lot in his beat-up Silverado with a portable mill in the bed, every single person who worked at Meridian Manufacturing knew that the new owner had called Ray's department overhead, and that on Thursday the line had stopped. They also knew, because Marlene at the front desk had heard it, and Marlene at the front desk could not keep a secret if you paid her, that Bradford had spent Friday afternoon on a series of very unpleasant phone calls. One with the private equity firm. One with the biggest customer, an automotive tier one out of Michigan who had a Monday morning delivery on the schedule that was not going to happen. One with his insurance broker to see if business interruption coverage would apply to a self-inflicted wound. It would not. Haverson and I worked press 3 all day Saturday and half of Sunday. I paid him out of the Meridian purchase order at a rate that would have made Bradford's eyes water if Bradford had looked at it, which Bradford did not, because Bradford had signed the blanket authorization Friday morning without reading it. Haverson recut the keyway on the shaft in place using the portable mill, which is not a common skill and not something you can hire out of a temp agency. He fitted a new key from stock he'd brought with him. We reassembled the flywheel with a torque procedure Haverson wrote out on a legal pad while he drank his second cup of the truck stop coffee I'd brought him. Sunday at 4 p.m. we brought the press back up. It ran. Beautifully. Better than it had run in a year. Haverson shook my hand, took his check, and drove north. Monday morning at 7 a.m. first shift came back in. The line ran. Bradford was in the plant at 7:15, which was the earliest anybody had ever seen him. He walked the floor. He stopped at press 3 and looked at it. He looked at me. He nodded once. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The math was already being done in his head and I could see him doing it. 60 hours of downtime. One Michigan Tier 1 nearly lost. A repair bill in the tens of thousands. And a maintenance department that, on paper, had done nothing wrong. Every single one of my guys had followed procedure. Every ticket had been closed within SLA. The CMMS report for the week would look completely clean. The only failure was the failure of the informal system. The system Preston had called non-value added on Wednesday. The system Bradford had called overhead on Monday of the previous week. At 10 a.m. Monday, Preston came down to the shop floor again. He asked if I had a few minutes. I said I did. He asked if we could talk in my office. I said sure. He sat down across from my desk. He did not have his tablet with him. That was the first thing I noticed. The second thing I noticed was that he was wearing steel-toed boots. Somebody had told him. He said, Ray, I've been thinking a lot about our conversation Friday, and about the situation this weekend. And I want to be honest with you. I think my initial assessment was based on an incomplete understanding of how this operation actually works. I'd like to spend some more time with your team before I finalize any recommendations to Mr. Kane. I looked at him for a long moment. I said, Preston, that's a very reasonable request. I'd be happy to accommodate it, but I need to be direct with you about something. He waited. I said, Preston, I've been in this building for 22 years. I've seen 3 ownership changes. I've seen 4 plant managers. I've seen the shop floor flooded, I've seen it burn, and I've seen it get audited by the EPA on a Friday afternoon before a holiday weekend. I've kept it running through all of it. Not because Meridian paid me well, though the pay was fair. Not because I love the equipment, though some of it I do. I kept it running because I decided a long time ago that the work mattered, that the 340 people who show up here every morning to feed their families deserve a plant that runs. That's what motivated me. That was my deal with myself. Preston was very still. I said, that deal, Preston, was between me and me. It was never a deal with Bradford Kane. Bradford Kane bought this building 3 weeks ago and stood on a riser and called what I do overhead. He did not know me. He did not know my crew. He did not know what he was buying. And he made a statement in public in front of 40 of my people that told every single one of us exactly what he thought of us. I said, you can't undo that, Preston. I don't say that with any anger. I say it as a fact. Bradford said it. My guys heard it. And once a thing like that is said out loud in a room full of people who have been holding a place together for 20 years, it cannot be unsaid. Not with a follow-up assessment. Not with a revised org chart. Not with a raise. Preston nodded slowly. He said, what are you telling me, Ray? I said, I'm telling you I've already made my decision. I wrote my letter Sunday night after Haverson drove north. I'm going to give Bradford my 2 weeks this afternoon. During those 2 weeks, I will train whoever you tell me to train. I will document whatever you tell me to document. I will hand off every account, every vendor, every password, every procedure. I will do it fully and honestly and without any theatrics. That's my final commitment to the guys who still work here. I said, but I won't be here in 3 weeks, and I want to give you the courtesy of knowing that now so you can plan accordingly. Preston looked at his hands. He said, Ray, the rest of the department. Are they? I said, I don't speak for them, Preston. Each one of them will make his own decision, but I'll tell you what I think. I think that when the department head who called them overhead is the man they answer to, some of them are going to make the same choice I made. Not out of loyalty to me, out of the same deal with themselves that I made a long time ago. When the deal is broken, the deal is broken. He sat there for a while. Then he said, can I ask you something honestly? I said, yes. He said if Bradford came down here today and apologized, if he stood on the same riser and said he was wrong, would that change anything? I thought about it. I said, no, because it wouldn't be true. He wouldn't mean it. He'd mean he was sorry the press broke. He'd mean he was sorry it cost him money. He wouldn't mean he was sorry for what he said because he still believes what he said. He just didn't know the price tag on it until Friday. Preston stood up. He put out his hand. I shook it. He said, for what it's worth, Ray, I'm sorry. I said, I know you are, Preston. Take care of yourself. He walked out. I sat down and typed my letter. I delivered the letter to Bradford's office at 2 p.m. Monday. Lindsay took it. She read the subject line, looked up at me, and didn't say anything. I think she'd already guessed. Bradford called me up to the executive conference room at 2:30. He was alone this time. No Preston, no Hollies, nobody. Just him behind that long, polished table that Mr. Halloran used to use for card games with the shift supervisors at Christmas. He asked me to sit. I sat. He said, Ray, I want to make you an offer, Director of Operations, full authority over maintenance, engineering, and quality. Report directly to me. Salary bump of 40%. Equity in the next round if we grow the way I think we can. I let him finish. I did not interrupt. I owed him the courtesy of hearing it out, even though I knew what my answer was before he opened his mouth. I said, Mr. Kane, I appreciate the offer, it's a generous one, but no. He said, Ray, whatever number you want. I said, it's not a number, Mr. Kane, and I don't say that to be dramatic. I say it because I've made my decision, and I want you to hear the real reason so that maybe the next plant you buy goes different for you than this one. He waited. I said you bought a building 3 weeks ago. You didn't buy a company. The company was in the people. And on your first day, in the first 10 minutes of your first meeting, you told the people what you thought they were. You didn't ask. You didn't watch. You didn't learn. You looked at a spreadsheet and you decided. And when a man does that, Mr. Kane, he tells the people something about himself that he cannot take back. I said, you didn't lose me on Friday when the press broke. You lost me on Monday when you said the word overhead. He didn't speak for a long time. Finally, he said, what are you going to do, Ray? I said, I'm going to work my 2 weeks, then I'm going to go home. My wife and I have some travel we've been putting off. After that, I have a few phone calls to return. There are some people who have been asking if I'd consult. He said, consult for who? I smiled for the first time in that room. I said, small manufacturers, Mr. Kane. Family shops. The kind of places where the owner still knows the name of the guy who fixes the presses. There are more of them than you'd think, and most of them are scared to death of somebody like you buying them out. I stood up. I put out my hand. He shook it. His grip was weaker than it had been 3 weeks ago. I walked out. I worked my 2 weeks the way I said I would. I trained a young guy Preston brought in from outside, a decent kid actually who listened. I documented everything I could put on paper, knowing full well that some of it can't be put on paper. I said goodbye to my crew one by one in the maintenance bay on my last Friday, and Roy gave me a bearing he'd machined into a paperweight with my name and dates on it. 6 of the 18 guys quit within 90 days of me leaving. 2 came with me when I started Ray Whitaker Reliability the next spring. We work with 4 family-owned plants now. I sleep well. Karen and I drove to Glacier in the fall. Meridian is still running, barely. Bradford sold it 18 months later at a loss. If you're sitting in a chair right now and somebody just called what you do overhead, listen to me. You don't have to yell. You don't have to sabotage. You just have to stop carrying what you were never being paid to carry. Let them see the weight for themselves. Then decide if you still want to lift it.